Hello, folks. This is Ross Fleming of Fleming Recordings Nelson, makers of phonograph records, especially those of the Kootenay Music Festival, bringing you another program of Kootenay talent and early-day Kootenay history, broadcast as a public service in cooperation with the 3 Kootenay radio stations, under the titles Fleming Presents over Radio CKLN Nelson, Salute to the Kootenays over Radio CJAT Trail, and Tales of the Kootenays over Radio CKEK Cranbrook. The Stanley Humphries Senior Band of Castlegar opens our program playing Orlando Paladino by Haydn, for which they received 84 marks in the class for senior high school bands. That was the Stanley Humphries Senior Band of Castlegar, under the direction of Norman Fishwick. One of our stories today is by Captain Alan Lean, well-known early-day resident of the Kootenay district, who in his later days operated the Queen's Photograph Studio in Nelson, Other pioneer studios were the Nealons brothers and the Wadd Studio. Captain Lean's name was spelt Lean and pronounced Lean by the family, but public usage chose to pronounce it Lane. Mrs. Emily Stubbs of Nelson was a receptionist at the Queen Studio. In 1893, Captain Lean received a certificate of inspection from the Canada Department of Marine for his steamboat, the Idaho, which was registered in New Westminster. Her gross tonnage was 6 tons, while her engine had 1.2 horsepower. She carried one lifebuoy with a long attached line. Her machinery, boiler, and engine were designated as sufficient for her use as a freight boat. Captain Lean tells in the Nelson Daily News of 1922 how his tug, the Idaho, gobbled up the crew's pork and beans when the boilers went dry in the year 1892. The Galena and the stuck-up steamer Nelson were the passenger ships of those days. The steamer Nelson was later burned as an attraction to the Nelson Chickamauga celebration in 1914. Now here is Captain Lean's story. In the spring of 1892, there were 2 passenger steamers on Kootenay Lake, the Galena and the Nelson. Captain George Hayward was in charge of the Galena, a twin screw boat, and the Nelson was in charge of Captain D.C. McMorris. She was a sternwheeler. The Galena was a relic of still earlier days, and was noted more for the good meals that were served on board than for her speed or comfort, but her calls were always looked forward to. Everyone along the lake seemed to feel that they had a personal interest in her. The Nelson was looked on as the last word in inland water steamers in British Columbia. Besides these 2 passenger boats, there was also a tug boat, the Idaho. She, like some human shes, had a past, but that is another story. She was not well-founded, as some of her successors, but she was a staunch craft and did her part in building up the new district. Besides keeping the sawmills in logs, she brought down many large loads of merchandise from Bonner's Ferry, Idaho, and quantities of hay and vegetables from the ranches along the Kootenay River in Idaho and on this side of the line. She was not a very commodious craft. In fact, she was principally engine, boiler, and tow line. The skipper and engineer slept in the only cabin forward, on a bench 18 inches wide, one on each side. The rest of the crew slept aft, somewhere when all the deck room was not taken up with cordwood, this being the only fuel available in those days. This left no room for a cook's galley. We had a cook stove, but it seemed to be always in the way, so it was donated to a needy prospector, and the cooking was done on live charcoal raked out of the firebox. The boiling was done with steam, a steam pipe being passed through a hole in the lid of the kettle, and tea, soup, beans, etc., were cooked without danger of burning. One evening we landed at Ainsworth, and found we had to tie up there for the night, so as to be on hand to take a barge out early the next morning. But after dark a storm came up from the south, and there being no shelter at Ainsworth Landing, we ran across the lake to the Bluebell mine. At that time the mine was not working, but a pioneer family named Harmon was living there. When all was made snug for the night, and the cook had hung the kettle of bean soup on the steam pipe to boil, the Harmons, with their well-known hospitality, came down to the wharf and invited us to their house to spend the evening. They made things so pleasant for us that we stayed until after midnight, and when we went aboard the tug, we found that the steam had died down, and as all valves in pipes were perfectly tight, this created a nearly absolute vacuum in the boiler. Now nature abhors a vacuum, and will seize on anything to fill the void. In this case, the only thing available was the bean soup. With the exception of a few pieces of pork that were too large to go through the pipe, the soup had all been drawn into the boiler. Had it had anything like the effect on our interiors that it had on the boiler the next day, it is a good thing we did not have it for our dinner. For 2 days, the only sound that we could get out of the whistle was a weird shriek, until the engineer investigated and found a bean in the valve. The title of our early day Edison cylinder record may possibly describe very well the travels of Captain Lean's tug, the Idaho. The National Marine Band plays the march Here, There, and Everywhere. That was an early day Edison phonograph record from our Frank Stringer collection. Our second story was written by Captain Frank P. Armstrong, pioneer captain on the Kootenay River in the East Kootenay, and on the Columbia River and our lakes. Captain Armstrong's family lived in Nelson for many years. He describes his first trip piloting the steamer Marion down the Arrow Lakes and making a side trip to the Silver King mine on behalf of a prospective buyer. Now here is Captain Armstrong's story. I don't know that I could give any better old-time yarn than that of my first trip with the Marion from Revelstoke to Sproats Landing, now Castlegar, in July 1888. We had heard great accounts in the East Kootenay of the wonderful finds made in this part of the country, and the great prospects for steamboating on the Arrow Lakes. Arriving at Revelstoke, things that did not look so bright. The catamaran Dispatch, built by Hume, Sanderson, and Cowan, would seem to be able to handle all the business in sight, and it was with no great vision of wealth that I started downriver. Among my half-dozen passengers were George Tunstall, Gold Commissioner, and John Hewson. These two were both good friends of mine, but had each a great contempt for the other. George looked upon John much as decent people now look upon Hearst, and John thought George was an incompetent old government grafter, but they had never spoken to each other. They met in the pilot house. Now, while a pilot house was big for such a small boat, it wasn't large enough to hold 3 men and a grouch, and they soon became quite affable, even friendly, and never afterwards was there anything but favorable comment of the judge in Houston's newspapers. We passed the Dispatch on the way down, and there was great rejoicing for a while, as the passengers expected to get into Sproats Landing a long time ahead of her. We would have, too, if our wood supply had held out. As it was, when darkness came on, there was no sign of the outlet of the lake, and I knew we had some 10 miles of river before we got to our destination, with, it had been said, a landing in stiff water just above a rapid. No one on board had ever been over the route. The chances were too big to take, so reluctantly I pulled into a good-looking drift pile and started to make wood, meaning to carry on at daylight. But just before daylight the Dispatch passed us. Bob Sanderson had run all night and beaten us to it. At Sproats there was only one passenger offering for the return trip, Dal Rhodes, a man I had known in the East Kootenay. A man who had come down with us heard me say that I wouldn't leave till next morning, and taking me aside asked me what it would cost to hold the boat another couple of days. I told him $50 per day. He then went on to tell me that he had money with him to buy the principal claims on Toad Mountain, that they belonged to a half-breed outfit with whom only money would talk. Naturally, if his offer was not taken after he had shown his cash, he wanted to get out of the country without any delay. He would pay me my price. Taking along roads, because he knew the country, we got horses through Ike Stevens, which we rode as far as Tom Ward's Ferry. There we got fresh ones, leaving ours against our return. We made good time to the Silver King, and my man got in touch with the owners. While he was doing his business, I was looking around, thinking he wanted no witnesses, but I was wrong, for when I got back to the camp I saw that he evidently had been waiting for me. As soon as I came near him, he turned to them and said, "I'm willing to take a chance on your claims. Here's $30,000, pulling out a big package of yellow American notes. There was a making of a pretty movie scene right there. It did not move the breeds, however, and after a few minutes' consultation, they refused to sell. In something like desperation, my passenger pulled a heavy gold belt from under his shirt, saying that while he had no business to offer more, and that this was his own private money, sooner than go back unsuccessful, he would add it to the price, making some $35,000 in all. That kind of staggered them for a while, but that was all. When my man realized that there was nothing doing, he became all nerves, and kept us on the jump as well, until we got back to the boat. Fred Chilott, Arthur Dick, and Dave Bremner were at Tom Ward's on our way back, and pressed us to stay and make a night of it. No explanation could be made, of course, and we carried on. It was not etiquette then, any more than it was in the Klondike later, to ask a man his name, and I never knew who the stranger was. He probably represented some American mining men. Only a few days ago, Fred Hume was telling me that he went up to Toad Mountain a little later, authorized to pay $85,000, and was turned down. So my man apparently never had a ghost of a show. Captain Armstrong's story appeared in the Nelson Daily News of April 1922, in their 20th anniversary edition. From the Kootenay Music Festival, Peggy Morrison of Trail plays the Sonata in E-flat, Opus 27, in the class for piano Beethoven under 21, for which she received 87 marks. That was Peggy Morrison of Trail. Bobby Stewart of Nelson now sings The Little Green Elf by T. Dunhill, for which he received 79 marks in the class for boys solo under 9.
There was a little green elf, and he lived by himself, 'neath a mushroom straight and high. And he danced beneath the moon in his tiny silver shoon, till he almost touched the sky. And he played a merry tune to the laughing silver moon. On a merry little pipe played he, till the moon began to sing, and the stars were twinkling to his hey diddle diddle, diddle diddle diddle, to his hey diddle 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 dee, diddle dee.
That was Bobby Stewart of Nelson. And so we have come to the end of another of Kootenay's own programs, produced by Fleming Recordings Nelson and broadcast through the courtesy of your radio stations. See you next week. This is Ross Fleming saying, so long, partners.
So long, au revoir, arrivederci, until we meet again. So long, au revoir, arrivederci, until that moment.